Hello, everyone. Welcome to Or This. This is usually my Monday morning quarterbacking of the scriptures and sermon for the previous Sunday, but it's Thursday and just getting a chance to kind of think back on these scriptures a little bit. It's been a rather busy week, but this video was from Sunday, November 12th. So my apologies for such a late Or This. Sometimes it takes me even time to... There was a time when I would have things kind of pop into my head during worship of alternative ideas for the day, but just didn't have any of those this week. And this is the first I'm really having a chance to think about these scriptures in like from a different perspective. So anyway, my apologies. And the scriptures for the day were from Amos chapter 5, verses 18 through 24, Psalm 70, 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 through 18, and Matthew 25, verses 1 through 13. Matthew 25, verses 1 through 13 contains a parable, which is called the parable of the bridesmaids. And the parable has to do with bridesmaids waiting for a groom to arrive, so they can have the celebration of the feast, the marriage feast. And they wait, and it gets dark, and they fall asleep. And then at midnight, the bridegroom comes, but some of them have extra oil to keep their lamps burning, and some of them didn't bring extra oil and their lamps went out. So the only thing they can do is go run and buy extra oil. Meanwhile, the bridegroom comes. Those who are already there go in, and they close the doors. And when the other bridesmaids arrive, who have replenished their oil supply, they're locked out, basically, unable to go back in. This parable is often interpreted as keeping watch for Jesus' second coming, when Jesus returns. But I have a little bit of trouble thinking about Jesus emphasizing that at this point, when Jesus hasn't left yet, and the disciples may or may not understand that Jesus is going to be going somewhere, that he's not going to be with them forever, as their rabbi, walking with them and teaching them and everything. And I mean, it is certainly fine to see this as, to read this as as being prepared for Jesus' return. But I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that we are still watching for Jesus now, in our midst, in our lives, in the problems that arise in our world. That we're not waiting. We might be waiting in some sense for Jesus to kind of come back and bring that all to an end. We're also watching for the ways in which the risen Christ is present here among us and comes to us in the midst of the trials and difficulties that we face every day. And for the disciples, they were still learning how to see Jesus in this person that they spent all this time with, to see God in this person they spent all this time with, to see God come near. And soon, in a couple chapters in this story at least, they're going to have to learn to see God being mistreated and beaten and put on a cross and dying, and kind of being able to see and experience God and figure out where God, through Jesus, where God is located in the midst of all that, what God's up to. And if we're not attentive to the fact that Christ is present or God is present in these situations, we might miss it completely. We might just miss out on seeing the miracle or miss out on seeing the God moment. That's why we're practicing seeing God. We were doing it more generally for a while. Now we're talking about generosity and the ways in which we see God at work through the giving of our lives, or the giving of something of ourselves, or the giving that somebody else gives. Where do we see God providing for others, or where do we see the goodness of God in the generosity of somebody else? And so that ability to be attentive and aware that God is present through the risen Christ among us. And are we ready? Are we prepared to see that? And that's, I talked about worship and how worship is formational. Worship prepares us to not only to go out and to be of service, but worship also prepares us to know where we will see God, to know where God through the risen Christ appears, and where are the places that God will be. And we learn that in worship. We learn that God is in the places where reconciliation and relationship happens. God is in the places where the hungry are fed, where the lonely are provided companionship, where the suffering are accompanied in their suffering and possibly even comforted in their suffering. But sometimes we can't take suffering away, but we can certainly accompany somebody so they're not alone in it. I mean, all of these different ways that God through the risen Christ is present. But are we attentive to that happening in these various moments in our lives? And I think that this parable speaks to that as well, not just a second coming that is off into the distance, that we're waiting for, we don't know the day, although that's true, but also the coming of Christ into particular situations where God's presence and God's good gifts are needed. And in order for us, I mean, God's there whether we see God or not, but whether we get to be part of that, whether we get to be witnesses to that awesome thing that God does, depends on whether we're attentive in these moments to God being there and watching for God and what God's going to do. And for that matter, sometimes God is going to do something through us, and being able to see our involvement. Well, I think that has to do more with that next parable that we have coming up this Sunday. Little sneak peek for you. The parable of the talents is coming up this coming Sunday. And I think that might maybe speak a little bit more to our involvement in what God is doing in the world, and how God invites us to use what we have, so that God's presence can even be seen through our involvement in caring for those in need, or in the work of reconciliation and forgiveness, and restoration of relationships. So there's some thoughts for you on the scriptures for this past weekend. Please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching. God bless.